Good morning from Panhandle Outdoors, America's only daily outdoor TV show. Your source for fishing, hunting, and information for folks who enjoy the great outdoors. Now sit back, relax. It's Panhandle Outdoors.
Well, good morning. Welcome to the show today. As you can see, Coach Chester's off traveling. He and Gail are out of pocket, so my name is Stan Kirkland, and I'll be filling in for the coach today. Let's go ahead and jump into the weather. It's brought to us by Haney Technical Center. The high today is going to be approaching 90 degrees, 87 degrees, 88 degrees according to one weather source. Low tonight will be about 75. Not a lot of change in the weather. I do not have the water temps today. I apologize about that. The river readings at Apalachicola, it's about 8.5 and flat. It's a good time to be, if you like to fish the river, a good time to go. The Choctawhatchee River at Kerrville is falling. It's 9.8 and falling. Holmes Creek is getting closer to being normal if we don't have any other monsoon rains. That's a place that I like to fish. The tides are brought to us by Kent Forest Lawn Funeral Home and Cemeteries. The high today, we have one of these unusual days where we have two high tides. We don't get many of these, but there's a lot of tide, a lot of water movement. It's a great day. Today is a great day to fish. First high tide is at 11:13 this morning. Low is at 3:36 this afternoon. Then another high tide at 11:09 tonight, and then followed by 5:44 p.m. is the next low tide. So two highs, two lows, but this morning, particularly if you've got a chance to go, you ought to go. Light breeze, the marine forecast, light breeze, winds out of the northwest, 5 to 6 miles an hour. Around 2 p.m. today, there's a slight chance, particularly on the coast, that we're going to have some showers. It jumps up to about 50%. But for people that are inland, you should see a relatively low chance of rain. We're going to take our first break and come back with us in just a moment. Well, thanks for being back with us. First thing I want to start with and say is Winston always has both Ken Paramore and I on the show with him. He's had us on to talk about our banquet, the National Wild Turkey Federation Bay County Longbeards banquet. We recently had the banquet. That was back in August, and I just kind of want to give you an update on that. Ken, of course, is our chapter president, and now thankfully Ken is on the board of directors for Florida, for the Wild Turkey Federation here in Florida, and they direct the Superfund monies, the monies that come from all of the banquets. That's money that's spent here in the state of Florida on public lands. But Ken and I, and we had a group, a committee that got that really worked long and hard in getting this banquet up and going 3 years ago. This is our third year. This year we had, amazingly, we had about 20 sponsors that stepped forward, and we can't thank our sponsors enough, but they put up the money that helped us get this banquet up and running, because it does take a lot. We had the banquet on August 11th, the night of August 11th. Amazingly, we sold just over, we sold about 200 tickets. We served about 200 meals, and we had about 150 people that wanted to become members of the National Wild Turkey Federation, which is a real testament. One thing that's interesting to me is when they looked at demographics, when we started talking about reestablishing a chapter here, they felt like that we would be lucky to get somewhere between 80, 90, 100 people to attend our banquet, particularly that first year. We far exceeded that, and we've also exceeded through people that care about wildlife conservation, particularly about the wildlife turkey management, wildlife turkey conservation. We've more than exceeded that. And again, we had over 150, but we had our sponsors, can't thank them enough, and there's, like I say, there's 20 I think there were 20 sponsors total, but and I'm going to miss some, but just off the top of my head, I know Mr. Gaynor with Bay Dodge, they were there for us. Also, Bill Kramer Chevrolet, Bill and Chris Kramer, C&G Sporting Goods, Derwin White with GAC, Panhandle Signal, Junior Kelly and his wife Pam. I could go on and on. Also, with Los Rancheros Restaurant, they stepped up and helped out in a big way. And those are just some of the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. And I don't mean to offend the others that I didn't call on, but we had a great response this year, and we look forward to doing that again next year. All of that money goes through. We don't keep it here. We don't spend it on frivolous stuff. All that money goes through to the National Wild Turkey Federation. We've already turned that money over to them, and we look forward to next year. For the remainder of this segment, I wanted to mention something I want to talk about this, and then when we come back from break, I'll mention it. I'll get back into it more. But I had hoped to have somebody on from FWC to come on this morning, but those folks are worn out. They've just gotten back from Hurricane Irma deployment in South Florida. They got in Sunday, and to say they're worn to a frazzle is the understatement, because not only did they respond to Hurricane Irma and what all went on in the Keys, but they were also involved in the Hurricane Harvey deployment. And I spoke at length to several people who were involved in that, and what they told me was simply amazing, and I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about that. But they initially, when they got the call to mobilize that was on August the 24th, they actually mobilized over in Pensacola, and they had a rendezvous point. And I don't know if you saw some of you may have seen the article in the paper that mentioned there were, I think, somewhere 160, 170 officers that responded, that were called out. And of course, none of this happens without a high level of work between Governor Scott, Governor Rick Scott here in Florida, and Governor Abbott in Texas. And so once they agree that Florida officers are needed, then they go through the administrative, the paperwork that give the officers the authority to act and to work in Texas. And so that's what had to happen before they could literally get on the road and go to Texas. We're going to take our next break right now, but when we come back from this break, I'll tell you more about their deployment, what all they saw in Texas and here in Florida. Well, thanks for being back with us. As I was saying before the break, the governor of Texas and Governor Scott here in Florida had requested that FWC come in and help in the effort following after Hurricane Harvey hit Texas and devastated Texas. And of course, the rain was the big thing. The officers amassed over in Pensacola before they went over an I-10, and I know when they were initially traveling over, one of my wife's friends posted on Facebook a photo, and she said it never made her more proud to see all of the FWC people traveling to Texas in a caravan, and she talked about how that brought tears to her eyes to see that. But they first went to Beaumont, Texas. It was still raining when they got there. This was, I think, on August 25th. It was still raining. Weather was bad, and it rained for days. You know, I don't know if you saw the totals, but I think it was an unprecedented amount of rain. They had 51.88 inches of rain that fell in that one storm. And places, what FWC did was, when they got in there, of course, the first thing they do is they go to these to the emergency operations centers in these areas that are hard hit. And the first place they went to, of course, was Beaumont, and then they went into Houston to help there as well. But they coordinate with the with the people there at the EOC. They have something called an incident command, and so they get all these requests in from sheriffs, from police officials where they need the most help. So they had taken their boats, the shallow draft boats, they had taken airboats. They did have some larger draft boats with big motors, the 23 foot type boats and bigger. They had some of those, but they were not as useful. The boats that they really used were the airboats and the John boats. They worked 2 officers to the team. They would go and they would rescue people. Some of the officers were telling me that on some days they would rescue as many as 50 to 75 people a day per boat. And it was just an endless sea of people that were really trapped in their homes. The water levels were rising, and so they would get, some cases they would have to talk them into getting out because conditions really weren't expected to improve. So they would get them in the boat, they would get their belongings so that they could, important things, papers that they wanted to bring, and they also made sure they got their pets. They never left any pets behind, but they would get all of this in pets. Some cases, the people would put their children in the boat and wait, even though they didn't know these officers, but they trusted them, and they would take these children out to points where they could safely get them to high ground, and then they would go back for the adults. The one thing that they relayed to me that was so different about the hurricane and Hurricane Harvey in Texas versus Hurricane Irma in Florida was the fact that they still had cell service, they still had power throughout much of the areas that were impacted. So they were able to talk on the phone. These people that were hard hit, in many cases, were able to tell other people and coordinate with other people to come get them. And so officers would take them out. They would take them out to points where they would drop them off, and then the other family would come in and pick them up, or they would get them to make sure they had transportation to shelters. One case, they were there, if you remember, there was I think there's a couple of reservoirs there near Houston that were really, they were up to capacity. These reservoirs were not built with this kind of rain in mind, nor was the floodplain below that area. It was not, when these reservoirs were built, there weren't the number of people, but the area has grown up. So what they had to do, and I believe it was the Corps of Engineers, if I remember correctly from the news accounts, they had to release the water. And so in some of these neighborhoods, people went to bed, or they got up at 1 and 2 in the morning in this west portion of Houston. They got up and water would be ankle deep in the streets. And then they would get up 3 or 4 hours later if they were sleeping in an upstairs, and the water would be up to the windows, or it would be up almost entirely in their first floor. Water would have risen that much due to these water releases that were having to take place. And I know I talked with Drew Nelson. He said that in several cases, the people were just almost to the point of panicking because they were it was dark, they were so scared. And of course, they were, a lot of cases they didn't have flood insurance. So they were the officers were trying to talk to them, trying to calm them down and just get them out of there. The kids, in a lot of cases, they were saying were more about getting out of there than even the parents. The parents were consumed about everything they had worked for. In some cases, everything they had worked for being lost, and that's certainly understandable. But they not only worked in Beaumont, they worked in Houston, they worked in Newton, Texas, a little place called Newton, and then they came back into Louisiana, a place called Leesville, Louisiana. They worked there, and there were waves of officers that went over. It wasn't just one group. There were waves of officers that went over and worked, and once they they were pretty well exhausted by 7 or 8 days. Then they would rotate home, and then there would be new waves of officers going in. So I think it's something that we can all be proud of, what they did in response. And credit goes to Nick Wiley, who who's executive director of FWC, and also Colonel Curtis Brown. I've known Curtis and Nick well for quite a number of years, but having worked with the agency, even though I'm now retired. But Colonel Brown is a great leader for the Division of Law Enforcement for FWC, and takes good care of his people. They've got good training, and so they get home. They get a chance to rest a little bit for a day or two, and then they get called up again because Hurricane Irma is bearing down on South Florida. And so they immediately have to gear up, even though they've only had a day or two's rest. The same group that is so versed in this and what's needed in this kind of waterborne response, they have to gear up and then respond in Hurricane Irma. And so when we come back, I'll tell you some of the things they encountered in their response to Hurricane Irma in the Keys. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we're glad you're there. Before I finish up talking about the FWC response to Hurricane Irma in South Florida, I want to mention something. There is a trout tournament that's coming up on September the 30th. Michael Harris, who we all know, Michael is the contact and the coordinator for this tournament. It's called the Seasons of Hope Outdoors Trout Tournament. It's the first annual tournament. Registration will be at Watson Landing. That's down off Business 98. For those of you that don't know, that'll be on the night before Friday night, the 29th. Or Friday evening from 4 to 8 p.m. Now you can also call Michael at 850-630-8187 and talk to Michael, but they've got first, second, third places for the biggest trout over 15 inches. Of course, 15 is the legal limit for taking trout here in Florida, or in the Panhandle. And they've also got youth divisions, so it's only $25. It's a very inexpensive tournament, but I know they would appreciate hearing from you. And it's for a great cause. And there's going to be country music and that sort of thing there at the venue at Watson Landing. With the remaining time we have, I wanted to mention though about what happened when they were responding to some of the officers when they got the word to go to respond to Hurricane Irma in South Florida. Some of the officers were directed to go over to quite a number of them were directed from here in the Panhandle to go over to an area just east of Tallahassee. It's called the Bo Turner Conservation Area. They went over in that area. Some of them that had not gotten there were actually directed to go to Herbert Field, and they were put on military flights. They were sent down on C-130s once the hurricane got through the Keys and they were able to get the runway open at Marathon. And so some of those officers were flown down to the Marathon area, were dropped off, and so other officers went down. They went first to Orlando, then they went to Naples, then they realized the impact was strongest or heaviest down in the area down in the Keys from Marathon south. So they started at Marathon, working together. They were primarily in there to assist other law enforcement agencies, but they had body recovery teams from the National Guard attached to them in some cases, but they went from boat to boat to boat, and of course some of these were houses, but so many people live on boats down in that area, and there literally were thousands of these boats and wrecked structures that had to be checked. I know when I spoke with Drew Nelson about what he saw and some of his impressions, he said to a person, the people that stayed, and he said it was amazing how many people that stayed that did not get out, did not take the warnings from Governor Scott, as well as some of the other people saying get out now for your own good. A lot of people stayed, but he said to a person when they would go in and they would provide humanitarian aid. Not only did they search, but they also took in water and MREs, the meals ready to eat. They had those to take into them to help them and to sustain them, but said to a person, they were saying, we won't ever stay again. Next time somebody says get out, we will, because they were that shell-shocked. But they worked their way down all the way from Marathon all the way down to Key West. And of course, in the last day or two, you probably have seen the footage of how much damage was done, particularly down in Key West and down in the Keys. And it's going to take them a long time. I did see that at one point, I think there was 6.5 or 7 million people in Florida were without power. Now they're down to, I think I saw the other day, it was fewer than 800,000 people are without power. So they're beginning to get the infrastructure back. I know I saw up on the interstate one day, right after Irma came through, it was moving to see how many power company trucks were coming down the interstate. And I don't think they were from Florida. I don't know where they were from, but it was literally hundreds of power company vehicles. And so on behalf, I think, of all Florida citizens, it was great to see people pull together and to meet this head on. So great response. I'm proud, that the agency was willing to step up and help in this. And people are going to be a long time recovering. The number of organizations, I know our church is sending, the St. Andrew Baptist Church is sending teams right now to Texas to help out to mud out these houses, as it's called, to get everything out of the inside, and will be for the next 3 or 4 weeks. And there's going to be countless opportunities for people to either help or to contribute. Well, I think we're out of time for today, but I want to thank you for watching and for supporting the show, and be back here tomorrow at the same time.
Thanks for watching America's only daily outdoor TV show, Panhandle Outdoors with Winston Chester, featuring hunting, fishing, and other activities and information to help you enjoy the great outdoors. Join us next time for Panhandle Outdoors.